So we're going to go through a bit of a transition here to our next topic. And now we're going to start basically working through a series of lectures to address the question that's on this slide. So how do we explain the broad observations of both the unity and the diversity of life? And there's actually a pretty incredible event that just happened that feeds into some of this to some extent. You may or may not have seen this in the news, but NASA recently announced the discovery of water on the moon in sunlit regions of the moon. And it's not a lot of water, so it's less water than in the Saharan desert, but actual water on the moon. And I think it really sparks the imagination to think about finding the fundamental elements for living things in other parts of our solar system and beyond, because that just highlights how incredible it is to have the diversity of life that we do here on Earth, and to think about where that life came from and how it persists. So that's really what we're going to be addressing through the remainder of the first Gen Bio course here. So here's kind of a list of the major topics we're going to cover through the rest of the semester. In this video, I'm going to talk about the history behind the idea of evolution by natural selection. From there, we're going to take a look at some population genetics, roll up our sleeves, and learn how to pinpoint cases where evolution is happening and where other interesting associated events are taking place. Then we'll explore the different shapes of natural selection. We'll talk about mechanisms of speciation. We'll zoom out and then start talking about macroevolution, and we're going to conclude talking about the history of life on Earth, and a bit about human history as well, evolutionary history. But for this video, our major focus will be on the history behind this whole idea of evolution by natural selection. And so for this video, there is some critical information towards the very end of the video, but I kind of recommend it more as one where you might get a nice, warm cup of tea or hot chocolate or another warm beverage of your choice, and kind of sit down and just listen to some of the story I'm going to tell you here and about some of these characters. So we're going to travel back in time again. We're headed back to colonialist Europe once again in the 17 to 1800s. And so to kind of set the stage for what I'm going to talk about, I need to note that people at this time had questions about how old the Earth is. And I think it's a pretty natural question. I think societies around the world ponder the question of, where did we come from? Where did this Earth that we live on come from? How do we make sense of it? And so here's what some of the major thinkers of the time thought about the age of the Earth. So first off, there's this guy pictured here on the left, James Hutton, and he had the profound idea that there must be slow, gradual processes shaping the Earth that he observed where he was. So he came up with this idea called uniformitarianism. So it isn't as though things just suddenly change overnight. Instead, slow, steady processes are at work. And that led him to the idea that the Earth that we live on has a long history. And you do have to contrast this with some of the other thinking of the time, tied to a lot of biblical traditions that said the Earth is a certain age, and this is when it was created, this is how it works. So this idea is kind of counter to some of the other major thinking about the age of the Earth at the time. And he really set forth this idea that change is a normal process when we're thinking about the Earth that we live on, and opened a little crack in the thinking about how we interpret things that are in the Judeo-Christian Bible. So maybe there are some alternatives to a strict literal interpretation of what's written in the Bible. At the time, people also had questions about fossils. So, if you poke around in the world long enough, you encounter fossils, and you wonder about them, and you can start to identify things that look like living organisms. So this guy here on the right, William Smith, made the observation that when you're looking at fossils, there are specific fossils that are associated with specific geological strata. So what do I mean by that? So one of the things that William Smith did was he created this incredible map of the UK organized according to the geological layers that were observed across the UK. And I only really learned this kind of recently, but geologically speaking, compared to, I think, a lot of what we experience in the US, the UK has some pretty gnarly geology. So this picture that I'm showing you right here, which shows, layer after layer of sediment very clearly, so it shows a lot of geological strata. Well, there are a lot of places in the UK where you can see that type of rock formation. So people who are living in the UK at this time, you probably grew up kind of thinking this is normal and this is what the world looks like. And so it'd be very common to poke around and see things in different layers here. We do have places in the US where you can see strata like this, but I don't think it's quite as common as in the UK. So here's just a picture of the map that Smith drew of the strata of England and Wales and Scotland, as he put it. And so you can see he colored those geological layers with different colors, and this kind of shows the association of those strata. So you notice that through time, some of those layers really got pushed up and are up high in elevation. But you could definitely map clear associations across these strata. And part of how we identified those strata was noticing that there are different fossils in these different layers. Okay, so that was those two guys, but they weren't the only prominent voices talking about this topic in that time frame. There's another guy here, George Cuvier on the left, who was studying a lot of these vertebrate fossils, and he noticed something else, which is that there were a lot of fossils for vertebrates that aren't alive today. So a lot of vertebrates had gone extinct. And he thought, well, this seems like pretty good evidence that there have been a series of catastrophes that have happened through time. So, kind of like what's written in the Bible about the Great Flood. And then, new species appear after those points. And, that raises another question. Well, where'd they come from? And Cuvier said, well, they must come from parts unknown. And another guy, Louis Agassiz, took that same idea and said, well, maybe this is evidence that there have been multiple new creations through time. So these two thinkers, relied on supernatural explanations for some of what they observed in the natural world. And they also became very powerfully opposed to alternative ideas about how the world came to be the way that it is. And so there's a lot of tension in who's telling what kind of story to make sense of how the world came to be how it is. So another guy came along sometime after that, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, and he put forth a very bold proposal to explain the organisms observed alive today. His idea was the idea that all species are descended from other species. And it's possible that he wound up developing this idea because he was studying microbes. So, he had a chance to actually observe microbes descending from other microbes. But he gets kind of a bad rap in a lot of the history of biology because although he had a very bold idea to express at the time, the idea that species come from other species, he got the specific mechanisms wrong. So his idea was that the way this process happened was organisms acquired characteristics in response to their environment over their lifetime, and then those were inherited by the next generation of organisms. And he also thought that this was the result of some very purposeful directed change through time. So species are kind of on a trajectory towards, some kind of new improved species. And so because he had some holes in his thinking, that left him very vulnerable to attack by other scientists who are more vocal and eloquent in arguing their position. So Cuvier attacks Lamarck's shaky thinking, and so Lamarck's bold ideas really didn't grab hold at the time. So from there, our next historic character is this guy, Charles Lyell. So Charles Lyell was a geologist, and he agreed with Hutton about these ideas of uniformitarianism. So he observed the same thing, drew the same type of conclusion. So he supported the idea that there is a slow, steady, cumulative effect of natural forces producing continuous change over the course of the Earth's history. And the important thing he accomplished was to gather evidence in support of this hypothesis. And not only did he gather that evidence, but he also wrote about what he had discovered. And came up with the thought that the evidence that he gathered suggested that these processes must have been going on for a very long time. And he wound up writing a book called Principles of Geology. And one of the reasons that I mention it here is because this book was picked up by another character we'll talk about in a moment as some reading material while on a very long sea voyage. And so what Lyell did was he basically raised some critical doubts about some of the ideas that Cuvier had been asserting. Okay, from there we get to a rather dour character. This is Robert Malthus. So he was another writer, and he was a cleric and an economist in this same era. He was also something of a big pessimist, so not a guy you'd really want to hang out with at a party, but maybe he did have a point, so sometimes it's worth it to listen to the pessimists. In any case, he wrote a book in 1798, so he'd been kind of evaluating, what's happening with population growth. And so his book was an essay on the principle of population. And his prediction was, he was looking around and, through a whole series of innovations, Europeans at the time were accumulating more resources, getting better at producing food. And what that meant, as far as Malthus was considered, was that meant people could have more children, and that would lead to an increase in the human population size. And Malthus saw the potential for the human population to start increasing so rapidly that it completely outstripped the resources available to sustain humanity. And those ideas might sound a little bit familiar to you. And in any case, he put out this essay, and this whole idea that populations might outstrip their resources and then cause themselves to collapse became known as the Malthusian nightmare. That this is a potential natural process that could take place in populations. So all that finally brings us to a real central character in biology, Charles Darwin. And I kind of like to tell a more extended story about Charles Darwin because for all that he had some really critical insights for the study of biology, he's also very much a human character, and so he's kind of relatable. So in any case, Charles Darwin was kind of a typical spoiled son of an English gentleman. And, so if you grow up with that kind of background, there are certain expectations about what you're going to make of yourself and do with your life. So a very common path for members of genteel society is to carry on and study medicine. So he got sent off to medical school, and he absolutely hated it. So that was not for him. At the same time, with where he grew up, he had a lot of opportunities to just spend time outside in nature. So he spent a lot of time just involved in looking around, checking out things in the world around him, collecting different types of organisms, just studying natural history directly. So with med school not working out, his parents were like, well, what are we going to do with you? You need to do something useful with your life. Another common route for people of his circumstances would be to, go to clerical school and join the clergy. So he went off to that, but it also really was not his cup of tea. He was actually really obsessed in particular with collecting beetles, because beetles are incredibly diverse and come in all kinds of shapes and sizes, and they're just astounding. So he's pretty obsessed with beetles. And he also, in his free time, made a habit of reading a lot of natural history books. And also, at the time, people would write stories about going on these scientific expeditions. And, that got Darwin just really fired up. He just thought that sounded like an amazing thing to do. So, after med school and clerical school didn't work out, there's another possibility for someone of his sort. He could be an intellectual companion on a long-distance voyage for the captain of the HMS Beagle, Captain Robert Fitzroy. So, when that opportunity came up, would he like to join in on this expedition? Well, Charles Darwin said, yes, take me away immediately. And he even managed to get his dad to foot the bill to go on this voyage. Pretty amazing. So this was not a short-term trip. Sailing around the world takes quite a long time. So he wound up on the HMS Beagle for a good solid 5 years. So they set out first to chart the coast of South America for the Brits. And so as you can see here, they spent quite a bit of time down in South America, but they actually wound up circumnavigating the globe. So we'll talk a little more here about the Galapagos, one of the stopover points. But I mean, check this out. Like, how great would that be, as a young adult, if you get to just spend 5 years of your life traveling around the world, visiting other places, learning about other cultures. It would be a great adventure, as long as you can handle rough time at sea and rough seas. So that's what he did. So 5 years later, he's making natural history observations all over the place. So as I mentioned, he read Lyell's book about geology. He also went through an earthquake himself. So there's probably nothing that quite convinces you of geological processes as actually going through an earthquake, feeling the earth move. And in addition to what he might have seen at home, he also had the chance to see all kinds of geological features across the planet. And while he was out, he also saw and collected a lot of really incredible fossils. So as one example, he spent some time up high in the Andes Mountains and had a chance to collect some seashells up high in the Andes. And one other thing that was very popular in this type of expedition was also to collect a lot of specimens. And people didn't just do this as kind of a hobbyist activity. At the time, it was also a potential way to make a lot of money to fund this type of voyage. So they'd bring specimens back to Europe, and then they could sell the specimens to people for a lot of money. People are very much into visiting museums and getting to see all kinds of curious specimens. That was really, in some ways it's kind of almost an equivalent to something like Instagram now, where just getting to see this stuff was highly entertaining to people. So anyway, as I mentioned, over the course of the voyage, they spent some time in the Galapagos Islands, and when he was there, he became very intrigued by things he observed about organisms across the islands. And so that kind of put some ideas in the back of his mind as something of a puzzle. So then he came back to the UK to think and write. And so here's some of the questions that Darwin started to ponder. So he really started to wonder, well, why was he encountering certain species in certain places? So, for example, one thing he noticed were similarities and differences between mockingbirds that were found on the mainland in South America and on the Galapagos Islands. We also often hear a lot about the finches found across the Galapagos. He paid some attention to those, but actually he was paying more attention to the mockingbirds. So why did that happen? He had the same kinds of questions that Lamarck had about, well, how did these different species arise? How'd they come about? What can explain this pattern? And so in 1844, he wound up writing an essay about what he thought might be going on. His idea he referred to as descent with modification. And he thought something different was happening from what Lamarck was thinking. He thought that the mechanism to explain the diversity of life on Earth had more to do with a process that he termed natural selection rather than inheritance of acquired characteristics. So he wrote this essay in 1844, but he hesitated before he published it. He didn't feel like he had a really airtight argument, and he also knew that his ideas were divergent enough that a lot of people would argue with them, and he might wind up, getting bullied into suppressing his opinion by people like Cuvier. So he mostly just kept working on writing out his ideas for himself. And here's a really fun doodle from 1837 where he's starting to think about his ideas. He even starts out, I think, on developing these initial ideas. Okay, so a good 14 years later, Darwin's corresponding with other natural historians, and he got a letter from his buddy Alfred Russel Wallace. So Alfred Russel Wallace had gone on a similar expedition in the Malay archipelago. So that's here, between Australia and Asia. This is a biodiversity hotspot in the world, and so Wallace, of course, keyed right into that, started collecting stuff, started checking stuff out, and also had some ideas. So he sent his ideas off to Darwin, said, here's some things I'm thinking about. What do you think? So Darwin gets this letter, and the ideas sound very much like Darwin's idea about descent with modification. This caused Darwin to go into something of a little panic of, what if Wallace puts forth this idea and he's the guy who gets credit for them? In other words, so we talk about this in science a fair bit, and I've mentioned another example of it previously, but is Darwin going to get scooped? Is someone else going to get credit for coming up with this idea? And Darwin had that idea 14 years earlier. So that kind of put him in a state of concern. However, when Wallace tried to more generally spread his ideas, they really only got a lukewarm reception. People were like, whatever, we don't care. So, at that point, Darwin thinks, okay, I need to put forth my ideas. They need to be thorough, so time to get my book out. So he writes this giant book called On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. Darwin's book wound up being an instant classic. So the original print was 1,250 copies. They all sold right away. And a lot of people will describe The Origin of Species as one long argument that contained detailed observations, inferences, and consideration of anticipated objections. So if you have a counter argument against Darwin's ideas, well, he's got a counter argument against that. And here's the major thesis that Darwin presents in this book. And I'm just going to read this out to you. His idea was As many more individuals of each species are born than can possibly survive, think Malthus, and as consequently there is a frequently recurring struggle for existence, it follows that any being, if it vary however slightly in any manner profitable to itself, under the complex and sometimes varying conditions of life, will have a better chance of surviving and thus be naturally selected. From the strong principle of inheritance, any selected variety will tend to propagate its new and modified form. So that's Darwin's thesis for this idea of descent with modification. And in The Origin of Species, Darwin supported this argument with extensive direct observation. So here's one that's really fun. So he writes, the black lava rocks on the beach are frequented by large 2 to 3 foot, most disgusting, clumsy lizards. They are as black as the porous rocks over which they crawl and seek their prey from the sea. I call them imps of darkness. They assuredly well become the land they inhabit. So he's noticing a connection between the environment and the organism. And in addition to relying on his observations from his globe-trotting era, he also brought in evidence from artificial selection experiments. So people at the time were as obsessed with birds as Siena students are obsessed with squirrels. And part of that obsession involved breeding different bird varieties. So this picture here is a set of pigeons bred up by pigeon fanciers to have very, very different characteristics. This is taking your typical city pigeon and just seeing, what kind of extreme varieties can result. And people do a lot of similar things with chickens also. So when we selectively breed for certain traits in organisms, if we're the ones making that selective decision, we call that artificial selection. So, Darwin said it's possible to get these strange varieties as a result of choosing who breeds with whom and seeing those traits get passed on. So, that then brings us to the contemporary forms of evidence in support of the ideas that Darwin originally developed and came up with. And there are 4 major types of evidence that collectively continue to provide support for Darwin's ideas. And so that's part of why Darwin's ideas are now accepted as being a scientific theory rather than simply a scientific hypothesis. There is widespread evidence in support, and we have not seen clear suggestions of any evidence against. And there's a couple of other things that factor in for something to be a theory. One is that it has very broad application. All that applies for this, the theory of natural selection. So our types of evidence include things such as direct observations. So by now, there are multiple examples of documented genetic changes happening in natural populations in response to shifting environmental conditions. So your book talks about one such example of this with a type of insect called the soapberry bug, where there have been genetic changes to feed on a new food type that appeared for soapberry bugs. So you can actually trace back in history to where the new food type got introduced and see direct changes in these bug populations. I also have a link to a video here about some of these observations in Darwin's finches themselves. So these are the finches found in the Galapagos that wound up being named after Darwin. And we'll watch this video during our lecture time. And if you think about it, you may actually also know of other cases of this having happened in our lifetime. So that's one form of evidence. Another type of evidence comes from what's called homology. So that is the identification of anatomical structures or developmental processes that are shared in common across organisms. So, all animals all start out as a single-celled organism, and you can trace development in those organisms, and a lot of the steps of that developmental process are identical or shared across a wide range of organisms. And kind of similarly, if you start to look around and compare across organisms, you'll see that a lot of organisms have very similar body plans to each other, and a lot of specific aspects of their anatomy are shared in common. We also rely on evidence from the fossil record to support these ideas. So the fossil record has really helped in some cases to kind of fill in some gaps. So there are certain groups of organisms where it's a little harder to see how those organisms might be related to other living things. But as we continue to explore different fossil beds, we often find intermediate forms that help us to understand those situations. And then the last form of evidence in support of these ideas comes from an arena called biogeography. So the field of biogeography involves bringing together our understanding of how the continents have moved through time with what we observe for species distributions in the world today to hypothesize about how different species groups might have evolved. And we're going to explore these forms of evidence in upcoming lecture videos. And so I want to wrap this video up just by walking through the mechanics of how this process of natural selection works. And so this is our modern theory of natural selection. And this is really, what Darwin identified to begin with. But he wasn't working in a time where we knew everything about some of these components. So he did the best he could with the information that he had. Here's how we now interpret this. So if we're thinking about natural selection, we're going to think about individuals in a population. And we can kind of relate this to something like the squirrel population on campus. So if you look at the squirrel population on campus, the individuals in the squirrel population are going to vary phenotypically. One way they might vary might be in how shy they are. So maybe some squirrels that are more bold, some squirrels that are not so bold. And so the next idea is some individuals will fit or match better with their current environment than others. So, for example, squirrels that are more bold might have more opportunities to steal food from Sienna students. So they're going to have an easier time feeding themselves through the winter when there's not a lot of food available. So then the idea is those squirrels are going to be ones that wind up producing more offspring, right? If you can get more food, you can allocate more of that food to reproduction, you're more likely to have more baby squirrels. And now a key component is if there's some kind of genetic or inherited basis to that variation, then what that means is the alleles that code for genes that make a squirrel more bold are likely to increase in a population over time. So this is the process of natural selection that winds up resulting in the larger process of evolution. So overall, for selection to happen, there has to be genetic variation in a population that's associated with phenotypic variation in that population, and that genetic and phenotypic variation must be correlated with variation in an individual's lifetime reproductive success. And we refer to that lifetime reproductive success as an individual's biological fitness. So it's not to be confused with physical fitness, Biological fitness is an individual's tied to an individual's reproductive success. So the next question that we're going to wind up considering is this question. That's all well and good to talk about as kind of theoretical concepts, but how can we actually tell whether a population is evolving, whether by natural selection or through other means? Because there can be other ways for populations to evolve that don't involve natural selection. So we're going to talk about that in the next lecture video.